Well, as I asked to talk about this, I thought my experience recently has obviously been much more about being on a board. But historically, I was the guy who used to prepare an awful lot of reports for boards. And indeed, some of my experience on preparing risk reports for boards goes back more than 30-odd years. And when I was really quite a young man to be in front of a board. And I was looking then at introducing measures of risk to dealing rooms and how we might do that. And so reporting to boards has always fascinated me, both from the perspective of what do I say to a board, how do I get my message across to a board, so how do they think? And secondly, on receiving information these days, sitting on boards, it is, well, am I getting the right information that helps me manage this business? And one of the themes of what I'm going to say to you, therefore, I've split into two, which is first, I'm going to try and give you a picture of how a board might look at reporting to it in a coherent fashion. I use that word a lot when I'm talking to the people who report to me and report to the board, because coherence in reporting is something I have a bit of bee in my bonnet about. One of the first things that struck me when I got onto a board and started to get reports was just how incoherent they were. And that has a lot of reasons, which I will go into. Some very good reasons why they're incoherent, but in one sense maybe very bad reasons, but they're incoherent, and there's certainly very defined reasons why they may be. And one of the things that I guess I've had some of my hardest moments with reporting is getting people to try and change that to a process where they understand what's in our heads as a board, what we hold as important, what we're trying to achieve, and then focus the reports around that. Now, it doesn't always mean that they have to tell us what we want to know. Sometimes they have to tell us things we would probably rather have not known, but we still need to know. So one of the things about that is I'm going to then focus this around reporting on cyber risk, which has been something which has hit my table fairly recently, not something that I'm particularly well attuned to, so I'm going to relate this a lot to the way in which it was brought to us. But some of the issues that came up when it was brought to us, and why the board took an interest in it, and why the board started to think about, or how the board started to think about, well, what does this imply for the way in which we run this business? Because new risks often do that, or at least it's not that it's that new a risk, but the realization of risk often does that. I had a very interesting experience in a discussion with my son about 15 years ago, and he was at university at Cranfield Business School, which is a military college, and he was doing IT, and the 9/11 had just happened, and I was talking to him about our risk models, our operational risk models, and saying, well, Gareth, our problem seems to be that, and we're discussing at the executive here, that these models are based on random events. And he said, yes. He said, that's, to my mind, come and talk to us and come and talk to some of my professors, because there is a fundamental difference. You have to realise that these days risk is not just about random events in banking. You've got to remember that you have enemies out there, and the enemy is out to get you. And we never, ever forget that. So our models are very different. They're not about random risk. They're about the enemy is out to get you. Cyber risk very much falls into that category. The enemy is out to get you. So let's see if I can start this. Boards will have some kind of model about the way in which they operate, some set of objectives. The two model, what I will call the two objective, model, has become very well entrenched, but it is moving on as we get to the next slide. The two model is, I've got a responsibility to my shareholders, and that's basically for the development of the strategy of this business and how that business is going to work into the future. So it's a very forward-looking and based on making sure the strategy is there and making sure that I'm monitoring the way in which, or we, the board, are monitoring the way in which the strategy evolves. and where the issues are, and that's again where this reporting comes in. And then there's one to the regulators, because regulators these days do mention publicly that they see NEDs as the first line of defence. I don't think they're right in that, incidentally. I think management is first line of defence, but nonetheless, they say first line of defence in making sure that regulation is adhered to. And certainly boards have become very fixated with that, probably over-fixated with it, as again I would hope to explain to you, because I think that is one of the problems that boards has got, is a sort of over-fixation with regulation. But to the detriment of the quality of reporting and the quality of decision-making. We are moving towards a much more looking at a multiple objectives model, which is really holding it around stakeholder risk. So what do we mean by stakeholders? Well, obviously customers. The FCA focuses very much on customers, so we're being pulled much more towards away from just focusing on returns to shareholders. I think it's an entirely good thing, towards customers as the foundation of business. Dead right, and we should do. Staff, and a lot's going on here. If you look at badly behaving staff, just look at the size of the fines that a lot of banks are running into. But also look at things like the Lambert report and the way in which the new senior persons regime, which is now a two-tier version, is going to bring a lot more responsibility for making sure our staff are properly educated and properly trained, including the board. I had an interesting experience of this because when I left Barclays after 32 years, I became head of the Global Association of Risk Professionals outside of the US. US head was overall. And I developed banking training regimes for Indonesia and China. And intriguing, the Indonesian one always interested me the most because it's an interesting country and almost very military in its thinking. And so they had very direct in its thinking. So they had decided that they would have 5 levels of examination, that they would map every job in banking and finance into one of those 5 levels. And if you didn't have the exam, you couldn't have the job. And it was that simple. So we ended up with 50,000 people taking the exams. And so that sort of thing is an interesting... When you see the Lambert report, it certainly doesn't... That's not the way we're going officially. But when you kind of get into the thinking of it, what you can see is that CPD points, training, education, improving the quality of education of our staff is very high on that agenda. So, so this multiple objectives and another one, is outsourcing, which has a big effect. One of the things, we outsource an awful lot of things, and then of course the PRA and FCA quite rightly tell us, well, you can't outsource the responsibility for it, and that's something which I think has caused a lot of rethinking. I'm not certain a lot of reshoring has got much to do with the economics as much as the sheer fright at actually having to be responsible for some of what's going on. But anyway, boards also have a series of sign-off obligations. The most obvious one is signing off the risk appetite of the business. And a lot of people now have got their heads around that. It was never a great phrase, I thought, but because I'm not certain anybody has an appetite for risk, they tend to have a tolerance for it. But we have an appetite for return as a board. It took quite a lot of thinking, particularly when it gets to board level, to get boards to focus on an appetite for risk, because their appetite is for return. Risk is something they run to get it. But it does make sense to boards in the sense that if you start with a strategy, then really what you're interested in is the risks that flow from the strategy. That if that's your strategy, all your risks are going to map to it in some way. If you don't have a business and you're not going to have any risks. But if once you've gone into business, you have got risks because you're trying to run that business. Added to this these days is the fair, balanced and understandable statement, though I always find the second half of it rather more interesting. It's called fair, balanced and understandable, but what it's basically saying is that, yes, what you present in your annual report has got to be fair, balanced and understandable, which, and it's necessary for shareholders to assess the performance, strategy and business model of the company. This is a requirement not just on banks, it's on all companies. It comes from the UK Corporate Governance Code. It became operational in 2014. It was put into place in 2013. And I've certainly served on a lot of boards where I would say not only didn't our customers understand, didn't have the information to assess whether the performance strategy and business model of the company. I've sat on boards where the board didn't have the information to do that, and tried to reform them. UK companies, whether listed or unlisted, now have to also prepare a strategic report. Absolutely vital, and I think, publish it. That is an enormous help, I think, to both boards in getting understanding of the business, but it's also an enormous help to anybody reporting to a board, because it means you actually have to have a copy of the strategy. I have always been shocked. I've done these talks for a number of years. If I do them to audiences like this, one of the things I often ask is put up your hand if you've ever actually seen your bank or business's strategy report, document. And the number of times that I get no more than a third of the audience put their hands up is quite shocking to me. These days, as if you're a UK company, whether listed or unlisted, you actually have to publish one. Does mean at least that your staff ought to get a copy, as well as your shareholders. So we have a good basis on which to start. So the strategy is the basis on which we start. And these three, taken together, I'm going to claim are vital components in creating a sensible and a target for the reporting structure of a business, a financial business. Now, how are we going to create that sort of core set of MI? What sort of core set of MI needs to come to a board for them to be able to understand, be able to both sign those things in all honesty, but also to actually understand all this? And that seems one of the approaches that seems to be taken very often, which I would advise you all to try and steer clear of as far as possible, is dumping very large and as many as possible reports on the board in order so that they kind of understand the business from A to Z. Of course, that really results in the board understanding none of the business, and those reports are bound to be incoherent because they're usually designed around reporting to various executive committees, which are looking at very specialist issues, and therefore they very rarely start or end with the strategy and the risk and whatever that we're going to look at. So we always need to start with the idea that a board looks at strategy and risk, and the risk resulting from it. So we've got this fundamental to building it is an MI structure, and that MI needs to support this connection between strategy and risk, and we call that a risk appetite statement because it's coming down. It starts with strategy. It's the risks that come from that. One of the things I will go on to explain to you is that it's not a risk appetite framework. A risk appetite framework is the thing that puts that into place. So when I've asked for the risk appetite or to work on the risk appetite statement, what I often get is not something that comes from the strategy. This is the risks that are associated with our strategy. What I get is this is how we control risk in this massive animal, and this is what it looks like. That's not the same thing. That is, how do you make this strategy, this risk appetite statement, the risks that come from our strategy, how do you make it operational? That's something the board needs assurance on. It doesn't need to understand it in great detail. It needs assurance that it's there. What it needs to understand in great detail is the relationship of back to strategy. So, and they will be looking for making sure that the right level of risk is being maintained. Because if you don't maintain that level of risk-taking implied by the strategy, you're not going to get the financial returns you're looking for, because return is connected to risk. So this is how a board is looking, and it's absolutely vital that that the board then sets, or people working with the board then set, a reporting objective. Okay? So we've got the objectives of the business, but now we've got to try and find some process of turning the reports into something the board can understand and sensibly deal with, aimed at making sure that it meets its regulatory requirements and its strategic objectives. And financial objectives, strategic liquidity objectives, etc. are going to come into this. And to cut a long story short, because it is quite a long story, these are the board reports which I feel are vital to understanding most businesses. So what we've got is a strategic business plan that the board expects to see. It then expects to see a coherent set of reports connecting to that. The financial projections, the capital plan, the financing and liquidity plan, the risk analysis, the sensitivity analysis, how did we get to the risk, and then it can devise from that a risk appetite. And also it can fill out a recovery and resolution plan, can feed into a resolution recovery plan, plans where necessary. Again, as you get into this, if anybody's getting into resolution recovery plans, please remember they're two entirely different things. Boards expect to see that difference pulled out to them, fundamentally, because if it's a recovery plan, the board is in charge of it, and if it's a resolution plan, the board doesn't exist. It's been replaced. And it's not replaced by the board, it's replaced by the regulators. So do remember that, they're two different things. These reports, this set of reports, which I've got a diagram on in a moment, I think, are not naturally connected to one another. Why are they not naturally connected to one another? Because basically they come from different people. If you look at who prepares a strategy report, you've probably got a strategy department. If you look at who prepares the finance, it's probably the finance department. If you look at risk, it's the risk department. If you look at liquidity and possibly capital, it's the treasurer and the treasury department. These are coming at you from different departments. And what they will tend to base the reports to the board on are their own versions of what they've reported internally. So very often they don't even use the same definitions. One of the things that you look out for in this is defining your terms. Very often they don't use the same definition of capital. Seems odd, but banks have lots of different versions of capital, as do other organisations. Economic capital, regulatory capital. So you've got a series of issues in there to do with how you bring them together. My favourite plan, frankly, is to stick the finance director in charge and tell him it's his job to make sure that what comes to the board is coherent. But what it is also is an iterative process. It's not a single linear process. We don't move from one to the other. We have to keep going round this loop several times. Why? Because sometimes we will find that by the time we've done the scenario testing, and particularly as we bring in, which I will come to in a moment, particularly as we bring in new risks, things that aren't probably in the original strategy statement, or at least are glossed over, not things that we would, that were taken into a lot of account at an earlier stage. As they come onto the picture, as they come into the picture, the scenario tests force us to look at a different risk profile. The bank or business has a different risk profile from the one in which we thought it had. So very important. So the risk appetite statement is top-down process. The RAF is much more bottom-up. But perhaps the biggest reason why these things don't is boards don't ask for it. One of the things that's always surprised me most is that boards don't take a very strong attitude towards this. They don't say, this is our picture of how we want it done and you must go and do it. What often happens is that they tend to be a bit buffeted. I think boards have seen so much regulation, it really is drinking from a fire hose, and therefore they tend to sort of, it is firefighting rather than actually having a strong view about, okay, how does this relate to how I run this business? It's problematic. Board committees also can be a bit of a problem. You will have board committees. You'll be reporting often to a board risk committee, to a board audit committee, to a board compliance committee. You may have a board strategy committee, though hopefully that will be board sitting together. But you will get different, it will get segmented. As it gets segmented, it also gets broken up. As it gets broken up, its coherence starts to fall apart if it had any in the first place. So that's a problem. And regulations, as I say, the drinking from a fire hose is also a problem because it tends to become a firefighting exercise. And we tend to look at regulations as a constraint. So here we have a statement that unless these things are integrated, the board's going to struggle to actually understand its business. So we need to see the strategy. We need to see the business model and its relation to the strategy. We need to see the way in which the risks are related to that business model. We need to see the earnings and the financial statements that relate to that model. And we need to see what happens to them when they get stressed, when things go wrong. And interestingly, in there, a very big difference in modern understanding of risk is that it's moved a lot further towards the insurance view of risk than it has from the old banking view of risk. Banking view of risk is very much a mean variance world. It comes from traders who are used to trading highly liquid instruments in highly liquid markets. What they see is mean variance all the time. Insurers insure extreme risks. What we've learned, if anything, from the crisis is that actually extreme risks, things behave differently. Risk is not what you thought it was, and it isn't just an extreme variance. It is a fundamentally different view of risk. It's fundamentally greater risk because a lot of things change. It's called dynamic conditional correlation. I do lectures on it, but I'm not going to do one here. So basically, this is the risk that, as a board should see it. How do we fit something new into it? And the answer is, when you fit your new thing in, whatever that is, and say I'm going to use cyber risk, it basically becomes another box sitting in the middle here. So you break them apart and you show how it relates to all the others. If you can draw that diagram and you've got lines missing, so I've just prepared a report for the board on cyber risk, and it doesn't show that it has any implications for our risk scenarios, you've got something wrong. Okay? Because it should do. You've now got to have a scenario in which you come under a cyber attack. If you're not modelling that, how the hell do you know what risk you're running? So you won't have a line properly out to risk because you won't have changed the risk appetite. You won't have changed the financial returns because the financial returns now need to show what would happen in those circumstances. But they're not going to. So do remember that when you put your new risk in here, and it's not just cyber risk, it could be lots of ones, but the thing you're looking at, it's got to find its way into all of these documents. It's got to relate to them. It's got to be coherent with them. Now, these are the ones that have appeared on my agenda recently. Bribery and corruption, know your customer, incidentally, anti-money laundering and sanctions busting. Tone from the top, board effectiveness measurement, professional standards, how we're going to educate the staff, and cyber risks. I was particularly interested in cyber risks because I probably knew less about that than anything else. I loved what came to us. I liked it very much. I thought the guys who had produced it had got their heads around it. Interestingly, a sort of historic statement at first. Why do you board need to think about this differently? Because you're all used to a world where guarding the IT was rather like guarding the till. It was, unless people broke into the bank and got into the system, there wasn't a way into the system. So basically, life used to be, for you know, didn't quite say it in these terms, but what they were saying was, for you guys who have been around rather a long time, your views about IT tend to be based on the idea that the world is as you knew it. And of course, it's very different. Today, we have completely open systems, well, much more open systems. So our customers are online to us all the time, continuously. It's a 24/7, 52 weeks a year connection, which incidentally has a big effect. You know, bank runs don't any longer need to happen with people queuing up outside of banks. They queue on their computer to hit you with it. So it's a different world. And in some ways, actually, the queues outside Northern Rock didn't do us any good because nobody was taking a view of people hitting their computers. What made the headlines is the people outside the branch, but actually that's not the way it works, really. People went to the branch when the computers broke down because they couldn't take the loads. But this difference in the way in which physically people interact with their bank is absolutely your business, because it being an investment business, is vital to understand how that's affecting your business. And we were told that we probably hadn't, in our original plan, done enough of that. It did the thing that I always ask people to do. When you give me a report, please define your terms. So please tell me what you're talking about when you're talking about cyber risk. Please make sure that I understand exactly what it is you're talking about and that we stick to the definition. So that was the definition of cyber risk that came up. There may well be different ones, and I'm not going to argue for one or the other, but what I am going to say is make sure somebody's defined it, because otherwise you're not going to know entirely what you're talking about. They made a big thing about both data storage and security, but also about this online connectivity. And clearly, this world is a very tempting target for thieves, robbers, because they don't actually have to break in anymore. At least they don't break in into your premises. They don't need to get the welding gear out and cut their way in anymore. It's a very different world. And it is a high-stakes game. And I quite like the word game because my mathematical background, I know what they mean when they say game. They don't mean it's a joke or a game you play with a child. They mean this is about outwitting each other. And it comes back to this issue that my son brought to me from the military, is remember they're out to get you. So one of the things that it then did was go on to give us some reassurance, in a sense, that we're not the only people affected by this, and that there is actually quite a lot of information out there. The internet has, in spreading information, also gives you some defence mechanism. It makes sure that there are means of you knowing how to address issues and how issues are perhaps being addressed or partially addressed in a national and international context. And that's vital, as I will come to in a moment with this particular risk, or at least I'm told it's vital. No, I'm quite convinced of it. So the UK has a national security strategy. Interestingly, if you want to dimension it, the sort of losses, that's the figures that came out of that. It certainly seems like a fairly extreme risk. They're not small. And these are actual losses they estimated over the last few years. There's also something called the World Economic Forum, which we were urged to take note of, because they do a lot of work on both defining risks in industry in general, not just the finance industry. They have a finance section. And their objective is to devise tools, including tools for boards, to assess their ability to deal with cyber risk. And one of the more interesting things is they're free. So one of the things we've done is certainly take their model, which is up on the internet. You can just download it and use it to do an assessment of our abilities to deal with cyber risk. So it's one of the things I would, just Google it. It's you can learn a lot from that. It sets a set of objectives, and we certainly took those objectives to heart. So responsibility and accountability, make sure you know who's responsible and accountable, and make sure that you understand what best practices are, which is what the report in a sense was all about. It also gave a context for governments and others to be working in this field. And for a reason that will become obvious in a moment, that became really important to us. It stressed this public-private partnership, a vital, both to curbing this risk, but also to knowing you're not alone. You've got governments to work with. We're used to thinking perhaps too much of our regulators as almost adversaries at times, but actually Waking Shark 2, which was an exercise carried out by the Bank of England to look at the UK financial sector and its vulnerability to cyber risk, very well published. Again, you can get all the documents on this. It's up on the PRA or Bank of England's website, and gives us gives us a way of looking at how vulnerable the system as a whole is And I'm sure Waking Shark 2 will come to Waking Shark 3, 4, 5, and will probably become an annual exercise for a while. Our response, well, mostly we're following the same response as other people have, layered security, and with firewalls, network design, passwords, intrusion detection, mirror sites, backup, encryption, all those sort of things that are, have we got a layered response to this? And the answer is yes, we should have. And we've set objectives for the company, and I think one of the interesting objectives here is the sort of recovery process. So how long does it take you after suffering a cyber attack to recover? Can you set some standards for this? Do we have this? Interestingly, do we have the skills at board level to address this? To which the answer was no, but we're getting them. The WEF gives you a sort of a picture of different kinds of people, because we tend to think of this as criminal. Again, we're back to our old thinking about people breaking in or trying to steal money. But you've got hacktivists, which are, may in many cases think of themselves as very well-meaning, but are a real problem because they're often quite driven individuals. You've got criminals, of course. You've got governments, and you've got terrorists. And governments and terrorists can sometimes be more or less the same thing, and sometimes much more dangerous governments than terrorists. And you've got corporate espionage. The government's one has come to the fore fairly recently. One of the other things we were urged to do is make sure that we actually had a trail, a forensic capability, or we are in contact with people who have forensic capability, so we can bring them in, to actually analyse. So our systems know when they've been attacked, how that attack took place, and can tell back to us how that attack progressed, what actually happened as a result of that attack. So basically, we'll need that. We might need it for our insurance, interestingly, but we will also need it to meet the requirements increasingly, or what we think will be the requirements of our regulators as Waking Shark 2 starts to find its way into regulation. So do we know where the attack route was? Can we recreate the attack? That sort of issue. If I'm giving you a picture of a board needing to, and perhaps a lot of companies needing to change a lot of their thinking, well, that's very much what I think the overall conclusion was. So you've got physical security, you've got IT security, etc. I said earlier that I wanted to talk a little bit about governments. There was a very recent attack on JP Morgan, and the conclusion of the investigation, which was taken place by the American authorities, was that it was a state-backed cyber attack. And it may have been in retaliation for certain limitations put on certain individuals from certain countries, access to, and their companies, access to international finance through the US dollar route, or anywhere else come to that. Which is an interesting one because that says it's a war and we are troops in that war and we can be involved in it. Whether we want to be or not is not the issue. Whether we can avoid it or not is not the issue. If we are open to our customers, we are open to cyber attack from states who think that trying to destroy or damage our business is good for their views on themselves. A very important organisation in, or at least we came to the conclusion, or the report came to the conclusion, that this organisation, the Financial Services Information Sharing and Analysis Centre, which is a US institution, and was only opened until last year to US companies and certain international companies that operate with the US, is now become global. And what it says to me, which I think was again a very important conclusion about this risk and about our reaction to it, is that whatever we do is necessary. We have to do what we can do, but it isn't sufficient. We will have to work with other organisations. We will have to work with government organisations if this risk is to be contained. So that was the report that came to me, and I'm happy to answer questions on it, but please do, please do remember, I'm not the IT specialist.